The bitter winter wind whistled through the gaps in the wooden walls of Blackridge, carrying with it the scent of snow and pine. Located in the shadow of the Rocky Mountains, this outpost had grown from a humble mining camp to a bustling frontier town in just 6 years. At the edge of town, where civilization met wilderness, stood a weathered cabin. Inside, James Harrington, a man of 52 years, stared through the frost-laced window at the darkening sky. His weathered face, etched with lines from years under the harsh western sun, remained impassive as he cleaned his Colt revolver with practiced hands. 20 years as a cavalry officer had ingrained habits that not even 5 years as the town's sheriff could erase. The gleaming badge on his chest caught the light from the oil lamp as he set the weapon down and reached for the coffee pot warming on the iron stove. The liquid was bitter and strong, just as life had taught him to be. He'd buried a wife and son back east before the war, then fought alongside men who'd become brothers, only to watch many fall on blood-soaked battlefields. The frontier had called to him after the war, promising something he couldn't name, but desperately sought. Perhaps redemption, perhaps just peace. I'd like to take a moment to ask you to subscribe to the channel. Where are you watching from today? The town of Blackridge had welcomed him eventually. A former cavalry officer with a steady hand and unflinching resolve, made for a natural lawman in territories where justice was as wild as the land itself. James had brought order, fairness, and a code that didn't bend, even when facing the barrel of a gun. The townsfolk respected him, some feared him, but all knew Sheriff Harrington would lay down his life to protect what he'd sworn to defend. A knock at the door pulled him from his contemplation. Opening it revealed Thomas Wells, the young deputy who'd been learning under his tutelage for nearly 2 years. "Sheriff," the young man said, his breath forming clouds in the cold evening air, "there's trouble at Henderson's ranch. Cattle missing, and they found tracks leading north toward Cheyenne territory." James nodded grimly. Cattle rustling was common enough, but the mention of Cheyenne territory meant complications that went beyond simple thievery. Relations with the native tribes had been tense since the government started pushing them into reservations. Any incursion into their lands could spark violence that neither side could afford. "Gather 5 men," James instructed, reaching for his coat. "Good riders, level heads, no hotheads, looking to make a name for themselves." The young deputy nodded and hurried off. James knew this could get ugly fast. The Hendersons were one of the most prominent ranching families in the territory, and Henry Henderson wasn't known for his patience or understanding, especially when it came to his property. As James prepared to leave, he opened the bottom drawer of his desk and removed a folded paper. The letter had arrived 3 months ago, carried by a trader who'd come through Cheyenne lands. It was from Running Elk, a Cheyenne chief James had known during his cavalry days. Unlike many of his fellow officers, James had treated the native peoples with respect, learning their languages and customs. It had earned him both criticism from his superiors and unexpected friendships across cultural divides. The letter spoke of growing tensions, of young warriors who didn't want peace, of broken promises from white officials. Running Elk had been a voice of reason among his people, but even his influence had limits. James folded the letter and tucked it into his pocket. If Cheyenne warriors were indeed responsible for the missing cattle, he'd need every ounce of that old friendship to prevent bloodshed. As he stepped outside, the cold air bit at his face, a reminder of nature's indifference to the conflicts of men. The stars were emerging in the darkening sky, countless pinpricks of light in the vast expanse above. They'd be the same stars the Cheyenne would see tonight, James thought. The same stars his wife had loved to name on summer evenings back east before illness had taken her and their boy. The frontier had given James purpose when grief had left him hollow, but it had never fully filled the void. Sometimes, in moments like this, standing between his town and the unknown dangers beyond, he felt the weight of all he'd lost and all he still stood to lose. Yet he straightened his shoulders and walked toward the stables. The town depended on him, and regardless of his personal ghosts, Sheriff James Harrington would do his duty. The Henderson Ranch sprawled across the valley like a small kingdom, a testament to ambition and hard work in equal measure. Henry Henderson himself stood on the porch of his grand house, his imposing figure silhouetted against the lamplight from within. At 55, he was built like the oak beams that supported his home, solid, unyielding, and deeply rooted in the land he'd claimed as his own. His face, permanently tanned from years under the western sun, was set in hard lines as he watched Sheriff Harrington and his men approach. "About time, Sheriff," Henderson called out, not bothering to hide his impatience. 30 head of my finest cattle stolen, and tracks leading straight to those savages in the north. James dismounted, handing the reins to his deputy. He'd known Henderson for all 5 years he'd been in Blackridge, and while he respected the man's determination and business acumen, he'd never warmed to his quick temper and quicker judgments. "When did you notice them missing, Henry?" James asked, climbing the steps to join the rancher on the porch. "My boy found the broken fence at first light," Henderson replied, gesturing to his son, Matthew, who stood nearby. At 27, Matthew Henderson had his father's build, but his late mother's softer features. He nodded respectfully to the sheriff. "Followed the tracks for about 2 miles north before coming back to report," Matthew added. "Couldn't mistake those unshod pony prints, Sheriff, and there were moccasin tracks alongside them." James nodded, taking in the information without revealing his thoughts. "We'll head out at first light," he decided. "No sense tracking in the dark, and we'll make better time with fresh horses." Henderson's face darkened with anger. By morning, they could be halfway to their reservation with my beef feeding their whole damn tribe. James met the rancher's glare unflinchingly. "And if we ride out half-prepared into Cheyenne territory at night, we could start a war that would cost more than 30 cattle. I'm not risking lives on a rush job, Henry. Not yours, not mine, not my men's." For a moment, it seemed Henderson might argue further, but something in the sheriff's steady gaze made him reconsider. With a curt nod, he turned to Matthew. "Show the sheriff and his men to the bunkhouse. They can bed down there till morning." As Matthew led them away, James caught sight of movement at one of the house windows. A young woman's face appeared briefly, her expression troubled, before she stepped back from view. Catherine Henderson, Henry's only daughter, had returned from schooling in Boston just 6 months ago. At 23, she'd brought Eastern refinement back to the frontier, along with ideas about education and native rights that had already caused more than one heated discussion at the Henderson dinner table. James had encountered her in town several times, usually at the small lending library she'd helped establish. Unlike many of the young women who'd grown up in Blackridge, Catherine looked him in the eye when they spoke, her intelligence and quiet determination evident in every conversation. But there was something else about Catherine Henderson that James had noticed, a sadness that sometimes shadowed her features when she thought no one was watching. That night, as the men bedded down in the ranch's bunkhouse, James stepped outside for a final smoke before sleep. The cold had deepened with nightfall, but the sky had cleared, revealing a breathtaking canopy of stars. "Beautiful, aren't they?" a soft voice said from the darkness. James turned to find Catherine Henderson standing a few yards away, wrapped in a heavy shawl. "Besides, you can never see them like this in the city. Too much smoke, too many lamps." James studied her face in the starlight, noting the worry that tightened the corners of her eyes. "Your father mentioned you've been spending time at the reservation school," he said. Catherine's eyes widened slightly, surprised he knew this detail. "Yes," she confirmed. "I teach reading twice a week. The children are wonderful, eager to learn, bright, just like any others." "Does your father approve of this arrangement?" James asked, already knowing the answer. Catherine's soft laugh held no humor. "Father tolerates it because Reverend Michaels vouches for the program. And Father respects the church, if not the natives themselves." Her expression grew serious. "Sheriff, about tomorrow. I know what Father thinks, but I'm not convinced it was Cheyenne who took the cattle." James raised an eyebrow. "The tracks suggest otherwise, Miss Henderson." She shook her head, the determination he'd noted before now fully visible. "Tracks can be misleading, or even planted. 2 weeks ago, a group of warriors brought a sick child to our ranch when they couldn't reach the reservation doctor. Father was away in Laramie. I helped them, gave them medicine. Their leader, a man named Two Hawks, promised friendship to our family in return." Catherine stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Sheriff, these were honorable men. Their word means everything to them. They wouldn't steal from us so soon after making such a promise." James considered her words carefully. Catherine Henderson might have Eastern education, but she wasn't naive. If she'd spent time among the Cheyenne, her observations carried weight. "I'll keep that in mind, Miss Henderson," he finally said. "But I still need to follow those tracks, wherever they lead." She nodded, accepting his answer. "Just please be careful. There are people on both sides who would benefit from conflict." As she turned to go, she paused. "You knew them, didn't you, during your cavalry days? Father mentioned once that you could speak their language." James nodded slowly. "I knew some of them. Made some friends, made some enemies, like any other people." Catherine studied him for a moment longer, as if seeing him in a new light. "Good night, Sheriff," she said softly, before disappearing back toward the main house, leaving James with his thoughts under the vast prairie sky. The first light of dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of gold and crimson as James and his men prepared to depart. The air was crisp, their breath forming clouds that dissipated in the growing light. Henry Henderson stood on the porch, rifle in hand, clearly intending to join them. Beside him was Matthew, similarly armed and determined. James had expected as much, and didn't object. It was their cattle, after all, and having the Hendersons along might actually help keep the peace if they could find the stolen livestock without confrontation. What he hadn't expected was the sight of Catherine Henderson emerging from the house, dressed in riding clothes, her hair braided and tucked beneath a wide-brimmed hat. "Absolutely not," Henderson barked when he saw his daughter's attire. "You're staying here, Catherine. This is no business for a woman." Catherine's chin lifted in a gesture James was beginning to recognize as a sign of her unwavering resolve. "I speak Cheyenne better than anyone here, except perhaps the sheriff," she stated calmly. "And I know Two Hawks. If there's any chance of resolving this peacefully, I can help." Henderson turned to James, clearly expecting the sheriff to back his position. James hesitated, weighing the situation. Having Catherine along could indeed be valuable if they encountered Cheyenne. On the other hand, if trouble started, having a young woman in the midst of potential violence was a complication they didn't need. "It's too dangerous, Miss Henderson," James finally said. If you encounter hostiles, as you put it," Catherine interrupted, her voice taking on an edge, "then someone who can communicate clearly might be the difference between bloodshed and understanding." Her eyes held James's steadily. "I'm not asking to be in the middle of a fight, Sheriff, but I won't sit home wondering if a misunderstanding led to violence when I could have helped prevent it." Henderson started to object again, but Matthew placed a hand on his father's arm. "She has a point, Father," he said quietly, "and she's stubborn enough to follow us anyway if we leave her behind." The older Henderson glowered, but after a moment he gave a curt nod. "You stay back if there's trouble," he ordered his daughter, "and you obey the sheriff's commands without question." Catherine nodded, her expression softening slightly in victory. As the group mounted up and prepared to ride out, James found himself watching her with a mixture of admiration and concern. She sat her horse well, clearly no stranger to riding despite her Boston education. When she caught him looking, she offered a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for not dismissing me outright." James nodded acknowledgement. "Just remember your promise to your father, Miss Henderson. If I give an order, I expect it to be followed." The tracks led them north, as expected, cutting through the rolling grasslands that stretched toward the distant mountains. James rode point, his experienced eyes reading the sign left in the earth. The cattle had been driven hard at first, then more steadily as the group moved farther from the ranch. By mid-morning, they had crossed into what was unofficially considered Cheyenne territory, though the formal reservation boundaries lay another day's ride beyond. The landscape changed subtly, the open prairie giving way to more broken country, with scattered stands of pine and rocky outcroppings that provided natural shelter. James called a brief halt near a small stream to rest the horses and discuss their next move. "The tracks split here," he explained, pointing to where the signs diverged. "Most of the cattle continued north, but a smaller group was taken east, toward the foothills." Henderson frowned, studying the ground. "Why would they split the herd?" he demanded. James shook his head. "I don't know. It's unusual." He turned to Catherine, who had dismounted and was examining the tracks herself. "Miss Henderson, have you heard anything about division among the Cheyenne bands?" She straightened, brushing dust from her hands. "There's always been some tension between the different family groups," she said thoughtfully. "But Two Hawks mentioned that a small band of young warriors has been causing trouble lately. Men who don't accept the peace treaties, who want to fight back against the encroachment on their lands." "Raiders," Matthew suggested, "young bucks trying to make a name for themselves." Catherine shook her head. "It's more complicated than that. These are men who've watched their hunting grounds shrink, their people forced onto smaller and smaller parcels of land. Some believe that accommodation only leads to extinction." James nodded, understanding all too well the desperation that drove such actions. He'd seen it during his cavalry days, the gradual erosion of a way of life, the broken promises, the mounting frustration. "We'll follow the main group north," he decided. "That's where most of the cattle went, and it's more likely we'll find whoever's responsible there." Henderson looked like he wanted to argue, but simply nodded, deferring to James's experience. As they remounted and continued their journey, the sheriff noticed Catherine riding up beside him, her expression troubled. "Sheriff," she said quietly, ensuring the others couldn't hear, "there's something I didn't mention back at the ranch, something that might be important." James glanced at her, noting the conflict in her eyes. "Go on," he encouraged. Catherine took a deep breath. Two Hawks. He has a son. Swift Arrow. He's one of those young warriors I mentioned who resent the treaties. Her voice dropped even lower. And he was among those who came to our ranch when the child was sick. James absorbed this information, understanding its significance. You think he might be behind the theft, despite his father's promise to your family? Catherine's hands tightened on her reins. I hope not, but I've seen the anger in him, the resentment. He looks at his father's cooperation with whites as weakness. She met James's gaze directly. If Swift Arrow is involved, this situation becomes much more delicate. Two Hawks is an important voice for peace among the Cheyenne. If his son is caught stealing cattle, James nodded grimly. It could undermine his position, possibly push more young warriors toward conflict. The implications hung in the air between them as they rode on, the weight of potential consequences adding urgency to their mission. The sun had passed its zenith and begun its westward descent when they first spotted smoke rising from beyond the next ridge. James signaled for the group to halt, then dismounted and handed his reins to Deputy Wells. Stay here, he instructed the others. I'll scout ahead. Henderson started to protest, but James cut him off with a raised hand. If that's a Cheyenne camp, we don't want to ride in like an attacking party. Let me assess the situation first. He turned to Catherine. Miss Henderson, I'd like you to come with me. Your language skills might be needed, but just for observation now. Her father's objection was immediate and predictable. Absolutely not. I won't have my daughter walking into a camp of savages. Catherine's expression hardened at the slur, but before she could respond, James addressed Henderson directly. Your daughter will be under my protection, and we're just going to look, not enter the camp yet. If there's any sign of danger, we'll retreat immediately. He held the rancher's gaze steadily. This is the safest approach for everyone, including your cattle if they're there. After a tense moment, Henderson gave a reluctant nod. James and Catherine made their way forward on foot, moving carefully through the scattered brush that offered some cover on the approach to the ridge. As they neared the top, James motioned for Catherine to stay low. They crawled the final few yards, positioning themselves where they could observe without being easily spotted. Below them, in a natural depression, sheltered by rock formations on three sides, was indeed a Cheyenne encampment. It was small, perhaps a dozen lodges arranged in the traditional circle. Horses were picketed at one end of the camp, and people moved about on various errands. But what immediately caught James's attention was the cattle, Henderson's missing livestock, corralled in a hastily constructed pen of branches and rope. There they are, Catherine whispered, relief evident in her voice. All of them, it looks like. James nodded, his experienced eye counting approximately 30 head, matching Henderson's report of what was missing. His gaze swept the camp, taking in details that told him this was not a typical family band. There were few women and children visible, and the men moved with the alert wariness of those expecting trouble. This isn't Two Hawks' band, James murmured. I don't recognize any of these warriors. Catherine studied the scene intently, then suddenly stiffened beside him. There, she said softly, pointing to a tall young man who had emerged from one of the larger lodges. That's Swift Arrow, Two Hawks' son. James observed the warrior she'd indicated. He moved with confidence, his bearing suggesting authority despite his relative youth. The other men deferred to him, confirming Catherine's identification. But where's Two Hawks? James wondered aloud. If this is his son's doing, wouldn't he be aware of it? Catherine's expression grew troubled. Unless he doesn't know, Swift Arrow could be acting against his father's wishes, gathering followers of his own. The implication hung between them, a possible split within the Cheyenne leadership, with the Peace faction represented by Two Hawks being challenged by his own son's war party. "We need to go back and report what we've seen," James decided. This situation is more complicated than a simple cattle theft. As they began to withdraw, a sudden shout from the camp below froze them in place. James looked back to see a warrior pointing in their direction. They'd been spotted. "Move, now," James ordered, pushing Catherine ahead of him as they scrambled back down the ridge. They had only covered half the distance to where the others waited when the sound of hoofbeats told James that warriors from the camp were in pursuit. "Run!" he urged Catherine, drawing his revolver as he turned to face the approaching riders. 3 Cheyenne warriors crested the ridge, their ponies kicking up dust as they charged down the slope. James stood his ground, weapon raised, but not firing. He had no desire to start a gunfight if it could be avoided. He heard shouts from behind him. Henderson and the others had seen what was happening and were rushing forward, rifles at the ready. Catherine stopped running when she realized James wasn't following. Instead of continuing to safety, she turned back, placing herself between the sheriff and the approaching warriors. "No!" James shouted, trying to push her aside, but she stood firm. As the warriors drew closer, she raised her hands in a gesture of peace and called out in the Cheyenne language. The lead rider pulled his pony to a halt just yards away, the others following suit. The young warrior's face was painted for war, his expression fierce as he leveled a Winchester rifle at them. James recognized him from Catherine's description. Swift Arrow, son of Two Hawks. For a tense moment, no one moved. Then Henderson and the others arrived, forming a line with rifles raised. "Get away from my daughter, you red devil!" Henderson shouted, taking aim at Swift Arrow. "No!" Catherine cried, stepping deliberately into Henderson's line of fire. "Father, don't shoot him! Your guns aim at a savage, but my heart beats for the man behind him." A stunned silence followed her declaration. Henderson's face contorted in shock and rage, while Swift Arrow's eyes widened in surprise. James kept his weapon ready, but shifted his position to prevent either side from making a fatal mistake. Catherine stood her ground, her body physically blocking her father's aim, her eyes locked with Swift Arrow's. "What madness is this?" Henderson finally sputtered. "Step aside, girl." Catherine shook her head, her voice steady despite the danger surrounding her. "I will not move and allow bloodshed when words can still prevail." She spoke again in Cheyenne, addressing Swift Arrow directly. Though James's knowledge of the language was rusty, he understood enough to recognize that she was asking for peaceful discussion, invoking Two Hawks' name and the promise of friendship that had been made to her family. Swift Arrow's expression remained hard, but something flickered in his eyes at the mention of his father. After a long, tense moment, he lowered his rifle slightly and responded in his own language. "He says he will talk," Catherine translated, relief evident in her voice, "but only with me and the sheriff. He doesn't trust the others not to shoot." Henderson immediately objected. "This is absurd. I'm not leaving my daughter alone with these savages." Matthew placed a restraining hand on his father's arm. "Father, the sheriff will be with her. And if we start shooting now, we could all die here today." James assessed the situation quickly. More warriors had appeared on the ridge, watching the confrontation unfold. They were outnumbered, and a firefight would likely end badly for everyone. "Mr. Henderson," he said firmly, I give you my word that no harm will come to your daughter. But we need to resolve this peacefully, if possible." Henderson's face was a storm of conflicting emotions: fear for his daughter, rage at her shocking declaration, and the She looked at James. "Shall we, Sheriff?" James nodded, holstering his revolver in a deliberate show of peaceful intent. He turned to Deputy Wells. "Take the men back a quarter-mile and wait. If we're not back in 2 hours, ride to Blackridge for reinforcements. Don't try to storm the camp yourselves." Wells nodded, though he looked unhappy about the order. As Henderson and the others reluctantly withdrew, James and Catherine faced Swift Arrow and his warriors. The young leader gestured for them to follow and turned his pony back toward the camp. "Are you certain about this?" James asked Catherine quietly as they began walking. Her face was pale but resolved. "Yes," she replied simply. "It's the only way." James studied her more closely. "And what you said back there, about your heart, was that true, or just a tactic to prevent violence?" Catherine met his gaze steadily. "Does it matter if it stopped bullets from flying?" Before James could respond, they had reached the camp, where curious and somewhat hostile eyes watched their approach. Swift Arrow dismounted and led them to the central fire pit, where logs had been arranged as seats. He spoke rapidly to several warriors, who dispersed to carry out what seemed to be orders. "He's summoning the other leaders of this band," Catherine explained, and she hesitated. "He sent for his father." James raised his eyebrows in surprise. "Two Hawks is here?" Catherine nodded, her expression troubled. "Apparently so, though he's been confined to his lodge. There's been some kind of power struggle." As they waited, James took the opportunity to survey the camp more thoroughly. He counted at least 20 warriors, all armed and watching them warily. The stolen cattle were visible in their makeshift pen, appearing unharmed. Eventually, a flap opened on one of the larger lodges, and an older man emerged, flanked by 2 younger warriors who seemed more like guards than escorts. Two Hawks moved with the dignity of age and authority, despite his apparent captivity. His face was deeply lined, his long hair streaked with gray, but his eyes were sharp and alert as they took in the situation. When he saw Catherine, recognition and something like dismay crossed his features. He spoke rapidly to Swift Arrow in their language, his tone clearly one of rebuke. The younger man responded defiantly, gesturing toward the cattle and then toward the distant horizon, where Henderson and the others waited. The exchange grew heated, with Swift Arrow's voice rising while his father's remained controlled but firm. James couldn't follow all of it, but the body language told a clear story of generational conflict and divided loyalties. Finally, Two Hawks turned to address Catherine and James in English, surprising the sheriff with his fluency. "My son has shamed our family and broken my word," he said gravely. "The cattle will be returned." Swift Arrow protested vehemently, but Two Hawks silenced him with a sharp gesture. "No, my son. You sought to provoke war when we need peace. You stole from those who showed kindness to our people." The older man's eyes settled on Catherine. This woman helped save Running Deer's child. Her family was under our protection, not our threat. He turned to James. "Sheriff Harrington, I remember you from many winters ago. You were fair to my people then." James nodded respectfully. "I tried to be, Chief Two Hawks." The Cheyenne leader's expression grew somber. "My son believes that all whites are enemies, that promises made to them need not be kept. He gathered these young men who think as he does, and they acted against my wishes." His gaze hardened as he looked at Swift Arrow. "But he is still my son, and these are still my people. What happens now will affect all Cheyenne, not just those who stole your cattle." James considered his words carefully before responding. The cattle must be returned. That much is non-negotiable. Two Hawks nodded in agreement, but Swift Arrow stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "And what of our hunting grounds?" he demanded, in accented but clear English. "What of the promises the white government made and broke? They push us onto smaller lands each season, kill the buffalo that feed our people, bring their iron horse that scares away the game." His eyes burned with the intensity of his conviction. Words and treaties mean nothing. Only action speaks truth. Catherine moved forward, her voice gentle but firm as she addressed the young warrior. "Swift Arrow, I understand your anger. The treaties have been broken, promises unfulfilled. But stealing cattle will only give those who hate your people more reason to act against you." She gestured toward the distant hills. "My father and his men are waiting. If violence begins here, it won't end here." Swift Arrow's gaze locked with Catherine's, and James suddenly understood the deeper currents running beneath this confrontation. There was history between these two young people, something personal that complicated the already tense situation. "You speak with two tongues," Swift Arrow accused Catherine. "You learn our words, teach our children, pretend friendship. Then you return to your father's house, to your white world." Catherine flinched as if struck, but held her ground. "I have never pretended anything with you, Swift Arrow. My friendship, my respect for your people, these are real." Two Hawks watched this exchange with knowing eyes before interjecting. "The cattle will be returned," he repeated firmly. "But Sheriff, I ask something in return." James raised an eyebrow questioningly. "The young men who followed my son's lead, they must not be punished by your law. This is a matter for Cheyenne justice. I give my word they will not steal again." It was a reasonable request, James thought. Pursuing charges against the young warriors would only inflame tensions further and possibly undermine Two Hawks' authority when he was clearly trying to reassert control. "I can agree to that," James said carefully, "provided all the cattle are returned unharmed and there are no further incidents." He glanced at Catherine. "But I can't speak for Mr. Henderson. The cattle are his property, and he has the right to press charges if he chooses." Two Hawks nodded grimly. "Then I will speak to him myself. My words, my shame for what my son has done, my promise for the future." The old chief's dignity was palpable, his willingness to humble himself for the sake of peace moving even to James's seasoned heart. Catherine stepped forward again. "I will help explain to my father. He respects strength and honesty, even if he doesn't always understand your ways." She hesitated, then added, "But it would be better if Swift Arrow was not present for this discussion." Swift Arrow's face darkened at this suggestion, but Two Hawks nodded in agreement. "My son will remain here while we return the cattle." He fixed his son with a stern gaze. "You have done enough damage with your pride." The younger man looked as if he might argue further, but something in his father's expression silenced him. With a last, intense look at Catherine that contained both accusation and something more complex, he turned and strode away toward one of the lodges. Two Hawks watched him go, his face etched with the universal concern of fathers for headstrong sons. "He has a good heart," the old chief said quietly, "but it is clouded by anger and memories of past wrongs." He turned back to James and Catherine. "Come, we will gather the cattle and return to your people before they grow anxious and foolish actions are taken." The next hour was spent organizing the return of the stolen cattle. Two Hawks selected several of his most trusted men to help drive the animals back, deliberately excluding those who had followed Swift Arrow's lead. As they worked, James found himself walking alongside the Cheyenne chief, away from the others. "Your son James said carefully. And Miss Henderson, there seems to be history there. Two Hawks's weathered face revealed nothing, but he nodded slightly. When she first came to teach at the reservation school, my son was there, learning the white man's words to better understand his enemy, or so he said. The old man's eyes held a hint of irony. They spoke often. She taught him English. He taught her our tongue. Both learned more than words, I think. James absorbed this information, pieces falling into place. Does Henderson know? Two Hawks shook his head. The father sees only what he wishes to see, but the daughter's heart is her own, not his to command. James glanced toward Catherine, who was helping to organize the cattle drive with quiet efficiency. It's an impossible situation, he observed. Two Hawks followed his gaze. The impossible happens every day, Sheriff. The sun rises, children are born. Old enemies find common ground. His voice took on a philosophical tone. 20 winters ago, would you have believed you and I would stand together like this, speaking as men who share concern for the same people? James had to acknowledge the truth in this observation. His years on the frontier had taught him that boundaries, whether between territories or peoples, were more permeable than most cared to admit. Before they could continue their conversation, one of Two Hawks' men approached with news that the cattle were ready to move. As the group prepared to leave the camp, James noticed Catherine glancing repeatedly toward the lodge where Swift Arrow had disappeared. Her expression was a complex mixture of regret, determination, and something deeper that she quickly masked when she realized James was watching. The return journey was tense but orderly. Two Hawks rode at the front beside James and Catherine, with his warriors helping to drive the cattle behind them. As they approached the place where Henderson and the others waited, James could see the rancher's face harden at the sight of the Cheyenne riders. He raised a hand, signaling Henderson to hold his position and not do anything rash. "Let me speak to him first," Catherine said, urging her horse forward. James and Two Hawks followed at a more measured pace, giving her a moment with her father. "The cattle are all accounted for, Father," she said as they arrived. "Chief Two Hawks wishes to speak with you himself about what happened." Henderson's expression was thunderous, his eyes moving from his daughter to the Cheyenne chief and back again. "I have nothing to say to him except that if any of his people set foot on my land again, they'll be shot on sight." Catherine flinched at her father's harsh words, but Two Hawks remained impassive. "Henry Henderson," the chief said with dignity, "my son broke faith with your family. He led young men to take what was not theirs. This was wrong." The direct acknowledgement seemed to catch Henderson off guard. He had clearly expected denial or justification, not a straightforward admission of wrongdoing. Two Hawks continued, "I have come to make this right, not just with returned cattle, but with my word that it will not happen again." Henderson's expression remained suspicious, but James could see the rancher was listening despite himself. "Your word hasn't kept your people from stealing my livestock," Henderson retorted. Two Hawks accepted the criticism with a slight nod. "A leader is tested when those he leads choose wrong paths. How he responds shows his true strength." The chief gestured to the cattle, now being herded toward Henderson's men. "I return what was taken. I offer my personal guarantee against future wrongs, and I ask that this matter end here, between us, without involving the white man's courts." Henderson looked to James, who gave a subtle nod. "The sheriff agrees to this?" Henderson asked skeptically. James stepped forward. "I do, Henry. Chief Two Hawks will handle discipline within his own people, and you get your cattle back unharmed. Taking this further would only create more problems for everyone. Henderson didn't look entirely convinced, but the practicality of the solution was evident. After a long moment, he gave a curt nod. "Very well, but this is the last chance. Any more trouble, and I won't be so reasonable." Two Hawks acknowledged this with dignity. Fair words, fairly spoken. As the two leaders reached this uneasy accord, Matthew Henderson approached, having overseen the return of the cattle. "They're all accounted for, Father," he confirmed. "Not even a calf missing." This final confirmation seemed to ease some of Henderson's tension. With a last warning look at Two Hawks, he turned to his daughter. "We're heading back to the ranch. Come along, Catherine." Instead of immediately obeying, Catherine turned to Two Hawks. "Thank you for your wisdom today, Chief," she said respectfully in the Cheyenne language. "Please tell your son." She hesitated, clearly struggling with what message to send. Two Hawks saved her from having to finish. "Some words are better spoken directly," he said quietly. "There will be time." Henderson, noticing this exchange even if he couldn't understand it, called more sharply, "Catherine, now!" With a last respectful nod to Two Hawks, Catherine turned her horse and rejoined her father. As Henderson, his daughter, and his men began the journey back to their ranch with the recovered cattle, James remained behind briefly with Two Hawks. "You handled that well," James observed. The chief's expression was somber. "Today was easy. Tomorrow is the challenge." He looked pointedly after Catherine's retreating figure. The heart does not always follow the path that seems most clear to others. James nodded, understanding the chief's meaning all too well. "What will you do about your son?" he asked. Two Hawks sighed, suddenly looking every one of his 60-plus years. "I will remind him of our ways, of the importance of honor and keeping one's word. I will try to show him that our people's future depends on finding a way to live alongside the whites, not in constant battle." His eyes met James's. "But I cannot change his heart. That path is his alone to walk." With those words, the chief gathered his men and prepared to return to their camp. Before leaving, he extended his hand to James in the white man's custom. "Until we meet again, Sheriff Harrington." James clasped the offered hand firmly. "Until then, Chief Two Hawks." As the Cheyenne riders departed, James mounted his own horse and began the journey back to Blackridge. His mind filled with thoughts of divided loyalties, forbidden attractions, and the precarious peace they had managed to preserve for at least one more day. The following weeks in Blackridge passed with an uneasy calm. James kept a watchful eye on the situation, half expecting trouble to erupt again, despite the agreement reached at the Henderson Ranch. But Two Hawks appeared to have reasserted his authority among his people, and no further incidents of cattle theft were reported. The town settled back into its rhythms, the brief excitement of the stolen cattle fading into just another story to be told around saloon tables or general store counters. James maintained his regular patrols and handled the usual minor disputes and disturbances that came with his office. Yet he couldn't help noticing that Catherine Henderson's twice-weekly visits to the reservation school had ceased. When he encountered her in town one afternoon outside the Mercantile, he noted the shadows under her eyes and the forced quality of her smile when she greeted him. "Miss Henderson," he acknowledged, tipping his hat, "I trust everything's been peaceful at the ranch." Catherine nodded, adjusting the parcels in her arms. "Yes, quite peaceful, Sheriff. Father has hired 2 more hands to patrol the north boundary, but there's been no sign of trouble." James hesitated, then asked the question that had been on his mind. "I noticed you haven't been visiting the reservation school lately." A flash of pain crossed her features before she composed herself. "Father has forbidden it," she said simply. After what happened, he doesn't trust them anymore. And he doesn't trust my judgment either. The bitterness in her voice was evident despite her attempt to speak matter-of-factly. I see, James replied, choosing his words carefully. That must be difficult for you, given your commitment to the children there. Catherine's smile was sad. Life is full of disappointments, Sheriff. We adjust and continue as best we can. Before he could respond, Matthew Henderson emerged from the mercantile, arms laden with supplies. Catherine, I've got the rest of Father's list, he announced, then noticed James. Sheriff, he greeted with a nod. Everything quiet these days? Quiet enough, James confirmed. How are things at the ranch? Matthew shrugged. Back to normal, more or less. Father's still on edge, watching for trouble. He glanced at his sister with a mixture of concern and exasperation, and keeping a close eye on this one as well. Catherine's cheeks flushed slightly at her brother's words, but she said nothing. James got the distinct impression that the Henderson household had been tense since the incident with the cattle. Well, I won't keep you both, he said, stepping aside to let them pass. Good day to you. As they walked toward their wagon, James noticed Catherine glance back at him once, a look of unspoken questions in her eyes. Whatever complicated emotions had been stirred by the confrontation with Swift Arrow and his band, they clearly hadn't been resolved by the return of the cattle or the passage of time. That evening, as James completed his final rounds of the town, a figure on horseback approached from the north. The rider's silhouette was distinctive, a Cheyenne warrior, judging by the way he sat his pony. James's hand moved instinctively to his revolver, but he kept it holstered as the rider came closer. To his surprise, it was Swift Arrow who emerged from the gathering darkness. The young warrior reined in his pony a few yards away, his expression guarded but not openly hostile. Sheriff Harrington, he greeted in English. James nodded cautiously. Swift Arrow, you're a long way from your camp. The young man's face revealed nothing. I bring message from my father, he stated, for you and for Henderson family. James studied him carefully, noting the tension in his bearing and the careful control in his voice. This was clearly not a comfortable errand for the proud young warrior. What's the message? James asked. Swift Arrow straightened in his saddle. Soldiers come tomorrow to reservation. They say Cheyenne must move again to smaller land farther north. His voice remained level, but James could hear the undertone of anger. My father asks if Sheriff will speak to white soldiers. Tell them Cheyenne here are peaceful, follow treaties. The request didn't surprise James. The government's policy of continually relocating native tribes to smaller and more marginal lands was a source of constant tension on the frontier. Two Hawks was wise to seek allies among respected white officials who might speak on his people's behalf. I'll talk to them, James promised, but I can't guarantee they'll listen. Army orders usually come from far away. Swift Arrow nodded, having expected this response. There is more, he continued, his voice taking on a reluctant quality. My father asks if Catherine Henderson will also come. White soldiers sometimes listen to white woman who teaches Indian children. Now James understood the young warrior's discomfort. Asking for Catherine's help meant admitting they needed her, something that clearly went against Swift Arrow's pride. Miss Henderson's father has forbidden her from visiting the reservation, James explained. Swift Arrow's expression hardened. So she obeys like child, not like teacher who spoke brave words? The challenge in his tone was unmistakable. James chose his next words carefully. It's not that simple. After what happened with the cattle, Swift Arrow cut him off with a sharp gesture. That is past. Now, my people need help. He leaned forward slightly in his saddle. Tell her this. Swift Arrow was wrong to take cattle, wrong to break father's word, but was not wrong about everything. His eyes held James's steadily. Tell her I remember promise made under summer stars. Ask if she remembers too. The personal nature of this message confirmed James's suspicions about the relationship between Catherine and the young warrior. He nodded slowly. I'll tell her, but I can't promise she'll be able to come. Swift Arrow straightened again, his face once more impassive. You bring answer to reservation tomorrow. Soldiers come at midday. With that, he wheeled his pony around and rode back into the darkness, leaving James with a complicated message to deliver and an even more complicated situation to navigate. The next morning found James riding toward the Henderson ranch. He had considered sending Deputy Wells with the message, but ultimately decided this errand required his personal attention. The diplomatic implications alone warranted the sheriff's involvement, not to mention the delicate personal elements of Swift Arrow's message to Catherine. As he approached the ranch house, he saw Henry Henderson on the porch, rifle across his knees, as had become his habit since the cattle incident. Sheriff, Henderson called out as James dismounted, what brings you out this way? James climbed the porch steps, accepting the offer of a seat with a nod. News from the reservation, he said directly. The army's arriving today to inform the Cheyenne they're being relocated again. Henderson's expression showed little sympathy. About time. Move them farther away, I say. James let this comment pass without argument. Two Hawks has requested our presence, yours, mine, and your daughter's. He believes having respected whites speak on behalf of his people might influence the army's approach. Henderson's face darkened immediately. Absolutely not. I want nothing to do with their problems, and Catherine is certainly not going anywhere near that reservation. Before James could respond, the door opened and Catherine herself emerged, having overheard at least part of the conversation. What's happening at the reservation? She asked, her gaze moving between her father and the sheriff. James repeated the information about the Army's planned relocation of the Cheyenne. Catherine's face paled slightly as she absorbed this news. And Two Hawks asked for me specifically? She asked. James nodded, aware of Henderson watching this exchange with growing suspicion. He thinks your experience with the school and the children might carry some weight with the officers. He hesitated, then added, Swift Arrow delivered the message personally last night. At the mention of the young warrior's name, Catherine's composure faltered momentarily. I see, she said quietly. Henderson rose from his chair, his expression thunderous. It doesn't matter who asked or why. You're not going, Catherine, and that's final. His daughter turned to face him directly, her chin lifted in that now familiar gesture of determination. Father, these people need our help. The children in that school. The children and their parents will just have to manage without you, Henderson interrupted harshly. After what happened with our cattle, after what you said during that confrontation, he shook his head in disgust. I still can't believe my own daughter would declare feelings for a savage who was stealing from her family. Catherine flinched at his words, but didn't back down. What I said prevented bloodshed that day, she insisted. And these are human beings, facing displacement from lands they were promised they could keep. Doesn't that matter to you at all? Henderson's expression hardened further. What matters to me is the safety and reputation of my family. You've already compromised both with your foolish sympathies. He turned to James. Sheriff, I appreciate you bringing this information, but neither I nor any member of my family will be attending this meeting with the Army. That's final." James nodded, having expected this response. "I understand your position, Mr. Henderson. I'll represent the town's interests as best I can." He rose to leave, but as he did, Catherine stepped forward. "Sheriff, could I have a private word before you go, about the school supplies that were left behind?" Her eyes conveyed a silent plea for him to play along. Henderson frowned but waved a dismissive hand. "Make it quick. I want you back inside when you're done." He retreated into the house, leaving James and Catherine alone on the porch. Once her father was out of earshot, Catherine moved closer, her voice urgent. "What else did Swift Arrow say? I know there was more." James hesitated, wondering how much he should relay of the personal message. But Catherine's direct gaze convinced him that honesty was the best approach. "He asked me to tell you that he was wrong to take the cattle and break his father's word," James said quietly, "but that he wasn't wrong about everything." Catherine's breath caught slightly, but she nodded for him to continue. "He also mentioned a promise made under summer stars," James added. "He asked if you remember it too." At these words, Catherine closed her eyes briefly, a complex mixture of emotions crossing her face. When she opened them again, there was a new resolve in her expression. "Thank you for telling me this, Sheriff," she said. "Please let Two Hawks know that I wish I could help." James studied her carefully. "Is that all you want me to say?" Catherine glanced toward the house, then back to James. "It's all I can say for now." The resignation in her voice was unmistakable. James nodded, understanding the constraints she faced. As he prepared to leave, Catherine touched his arm lightly. "Sheriff, please do what you can for them. The relocation, it will be hard on the elderly, the children." Her concern was genuine, transcending whatever personal complications existed between her and Swift Arrow. "I'll do my best," James promised, though they both knew his influence with Army officers would be limited. As he mounted his horse and rode away, he glanced back to see Catherine still standing on the porch, a solitary figure against the weathered wood of the ranch house. The weight of divided loyalties was evident in her posture, caught between family obligations and deeper personal convictions. James turned his horse toward the reservation, his mind working through what approach might best serve the interests of peace in what promised to be a tense confrontation. The reservation was already bustling with activity when James arrived. Army wagons were parked in a neat row, and blue-uniformed soldiers moved efficiently about their tasks. A large tent had been erected in the center of the main area, presumably for the official meeting. Two Hawks stood outside his lodge with several other elders, their faces grave as they watched the military preparations. The chief spotted James and moved to greet him, his eyes scanning the area behind the sheriff. "You come alone," Two Hawks observed, making it a statement rather than a question. James nodded. Henderson refused to come, and he forbade his daughter from attending as well. The disappointment in the chief's eyes was evident, though not unexpected. "She sends her regrets," James added, "and her concern for your people, especially the children." Two Hawks accepted this with a slight nod. "And my son's message to her?" he asked quietly. James met the old chief's knowing gaze. "She received it. That's all I can say." Two Hawks seemed to understand the unspoken complexities. "It is as it is," he said philosophically. "Come, the bluecoats wait to speak their words." Inside the tent, a table had been set up with maps and documents. Two Army officers stood examining these, while several Cheyenne elders waited silently along one side. The senior officer, a major by his insignia, looked up as James and Two Hawks entered. "Sheriff Harrington," he acknowledged with a nod. "I didn't expect to see Town Laud involved in this matter." "I'm here at Chief Two Hawks' request," James explained. to observe and perhaps offer some context about the peaceful relations between his band and Blackridge. The Major's expression suggested he found this irrelevant, but he gestured for James to take a seat. "As you wish, though our orders are quite clear." Two Hawks positioned himself with dignity across from the officers. "We will listen to your words," he said formally. What followed was exactly what James had feared. The Major outlined the new boundaries of the reservation, approximately half its current size, and the timeline for relocation, which was to begin immediately and be completed within 2 weeks. The reasons given were the standard bureaucratic explanations: treaty revisions, administrative consolidation, better management of resources. But the reality, as everyone in the tent understood, was that white settlers wanted the land, and the government was accommodating them at the expense of previous promises to the Cheyenne. Two Hawks and the other elders listened without interruption, their faces betraying nothing of their thoughts. When the Major finished, Two Hawks spoke with measured dignity. "This land was given to us by your government's treaty 3 summers ago. We were told it would be ours for as long as the grass grows and the rivers flow. Now you say these words were only temporary?" The Major shifted uncomfortably, but held firm. "Circumstances change, Chief Two Hawks. The needs of the territory have evolved. The new reservation land will be even further from hunting grounds, with poorer soil and less water." Two Hawks finished for him. "We have seen this pattern before." James decided it was time to intervene. "Major, Two Hawks and his people have been peaceful neighbors to Blackridge. They've honored their agreements, even in difficult circumstances. Is there no flexibility in your orders? Perhaps a longer transition period, or maintaining at least the eastern portion of the current reservation?" The Major frowned at this interference. "Sheriff, with all due respect, this is an Army matter, not a local law enforcement concern." He turned back to Two Hawks. "The terms are non-negotiable. The relocation begins tomorrow." As this pronouncement hung in the air, a commotion outside the tent drew everyone's attention. Raised voices could be heard, including one that James recognized with surprise. The tent flap was pushed aside, and Catherine Henderson entered, her riding clothes dusty from hard travel, her face flushed but determined. Behind her, Swift Arrow stood with an expression that mingled defiance and something that looked remarkably like pride. "I apologize for the interruption," Catherine said, addressing the startled officers. "I'm Catherine Henderson. I ran the school here on the reservation, and I'd like to speak on behalf of these people who have become my friends." The Major recovered from his surprise and gestured to an empty chair. "Miss Henderson, this is unexpected, but please, join us." Two Hawks' eyes showed a glimmer of hope at this development, while James wondered exactly how Catherine had managed to defy her father's explicit prohibition. She took the offered seat with composure, nodding respectfully to Two Hawks before addressing the officers. "Gentlemen, I understand you have orders that seem clear-cut on paper, but the reality on the ground is more complex." She spoke with the confident articulation of her Eastern education, her voice steady and reasoned. "The children in my school are just beginning to benefit from consistent education. The elders have established healing gardens with plants that took seasons to cultivate. The entire community has invested in this location based on promises made to them." She gestured to the maps on the table. "Surely there must be some compromise possible that honors both your orders and the government's previous commitments." The Major listened with surprising attentiveness, perhaps influenced by Catherine's evident refinement and education. "Miss Henderson, While I appreciate your concern for these people, the boundaries have been determined at levels far above my authority to change. Catherine leaned forward slightly. I'm not asking you to change the boundaries, Major. I'm asking you to consider a phased implementation. Allow the eastern portion to remain under Cheyenne control for 1 more year. This would give the school term time to complete, allow for harvest of the current crops, and provide time for proper preparation of the new lands. She smiled diplomatically. It would also reflect well on the Army's humanitarian concerns, which I'm sure are as important to you as fulfilling the technical aspects of your orders. The Major exchanged glances with his junior officer, clearly considering this approach. A phased implementation wasn't specifically prohibited in our orders, he admitted cautiously. Two Hawks, recognizing the opening, spoke again. 1 year for the eastern lands would allow us to move with dignity, not as frightened animals chased by hunters. The discussion continued along these lines, with Catherine offering practical suggestions that framed the compromise as beneficial to all parties. James watched with admiration as she navigated the complex dynamics of the negotiation. Her intelligence and compassion working in tandem to find a solution that might preserve some measure of fairness in an inherently unjust situation. Eventually, the Major conceded to a modified plan. The eastern third of the reservation would remain under Cheyenne control for 8 additional months, allowing for completion of the school term and harvest of crops. The rest of the relocation would proceed as originally scheduled. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a significant improvement over the original orders. As the meeting concluded, Two Hawks expressed his formal thanks to the officers, to James, and especially to Catherine. Outside the tent as the Army officers returned to their men, Catherine found herself standing with James, Two Hawks, and Swift Arrow. "Thank you for coming," Two Hawks said to her, genuine gratitude in his voice. "Your words helped where ours alone would have failed." Catherine shook her head modestly. "I only wish I could have done more." Her eyes moved to Swift Arrow, who had remained silent throughout the negotiations, but whose presence had been a palpable force in the tent. "I received your message," she said softly in Cheyenne. The young warrior's expression remained guarded, but his eyes softened slightly. "And you remembered," he replied in the same language. Two Hawks, displaying the wisdom of his years, placed a hand on James's shoulder. "Sheriff, I would show you the school building. Perhaps you can advise how it might be dismantled for transport when the time comes." James understood the chief's intention to give the young people a moment of privacy, and he nodded in agreement. As he walked away with Two Hawks, he glanced back to see Catherine and Swift Arrow standing close together, their conversation intense but too quiet to overhear. Whatever had passed between them in previous months, whatever promise had been made under summer stars, it was clearly significant enough to bring Catherine here against her father's explicit commands. The implications of this were troubling. Henry Henderson was not a man who forgave disobedience easily, especially when it involved the Cheyenne he so deeply distrusted. Catherine's choice to come here today would have consequences that extended beyond this temporary victory for Two Hawks' people. As if reading his thoughts, Two Hawks spoke quietly. "The young woman has a brave heart. She risks much by coming here," James nodded. "Her father will be furious." The chief's expression grew somber. "And my son's heart is divided between his people's struggles and what he feels for her. Neither path is easy." They walked in silence for a moment before Two Hawks continued. "In the old days, before the white man came in such numbers, there were sometimes marriages between tribes that had been enemies. It brought peace, understanding between different peoples. He sighed. But now, the divide is too great. My son knows this, even as he fights against accepting it. James considered the chief's words, recognizing the painful truth in them. The world was changing rapidly around them all, redrawing boundaries both geographical and personal. "What will you do now?" he asked. Two hawks gestured to the reservation around them. "We will prepare to move as we have done before. We will take what can be carried, leave behind what cannot. We will adapt and survive, as we always have." When they returned to the central area, Catherine and Swift Arrow had concluded their private conversation. Both wore expressions that spoke of difficult resolutions reached. Catherine turned to James. "Sheriff, I should return to the ranch. My father will be looking for me by now." The concern in her voice was evident. She was under no illusions about the reception that awaited her. "I'll ride with you," James offered. "It might help to have someone else there when you explain where you've been." Catherine smiled gratefully. "Thank you." Before departing, she turned to Two Hawks and spoke in Cheyenne, formal words of respect and farewell. The old chief responded in kind, his weathered face solemn but his eyes warm with appreciation. Then, with visible hesitation, Catherine extended her hand to Swift Arrow. "Goodbye," she said simply, in English. The young warrior took her hand briefly, his expression complex. "Until the next time our paths cross," he replied, using a Cheyenne phrase that acknowledged parting without finality. As James and Catherine rode away from the reservation, she maintained a thoughtful silence for several miles. Finally, she spoke. "He's going to disown me, isn't he?" The question wasn't really seeking an answer. They both knew Henry Henderson's likely reaction. James chose his words carefully. "Your father is a proud man who believes in certain boundaries between peoples, but he also loves you. Given time, he might come to understand why you did what you did today." Catherine's smile was sad and knowing. "You don't believe that any more than I do, Sheriff." She straightened in her saddle, facing forward with renewed determination. "But I couldn't have done otherwise. Some principles matter more than even family approval." James studied her profile, impressed by her courage despite his concerns for her welfare. "What will you do if he does disown you?" he asked gently. Catherine considered the question seriously. "I have my education. I could teach in Laramie or Cheyenne City, or return east, though that feels like retreating." She glanced at James. "Whatever happens, I won't regret today's choice. Those children deserve their full school term. Those elders deserve time to prepare properly for yet another displacement." Her conviction was evident in every word. "And Swift Arrow?" James asked, knowing he was venturing onto personal ground, but feeling it necessary to understand the full dimensions of the situation. Catherine's expression grew complicated. "He's leaving," she said quietly. "After the eastern section is finally vacated, he's going north to join his mother's people. He believes the future for the Cheyenne lies in maintaining their traditions away from white influence, not in compromise and adaptation as his father believes." She paused, then added, "He asked me to go with him." James couldn't hide his surprise at this revelation. "And?" Catherine shook her head slowly. "I told him I couldn't. That our worlds are too different, our paths too separate, despite what we might feel." Her eyes reflected pain, but also clarity. Sometimes loving someone means recognizing that you cannot bridge the divide between your lives, no matter how much you might wish to. The maturity and wisdom in this acknowledgement impressed James deeply. Catherine Henderson had clearly done a great deal of growing up during her time on the frontier. By the time they reached the Henderson Ranch, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in dramatic oranges and reds. Henry Henderson stood on the porch, his face a storm cloud of anger as he watched them approach. Matthew stood beside him, his expression concerned but less overtly hostile. "Catherine Elizabeth Henderson," her father thundered as they dismounted. "Where in God's name have you been? And don't bother lying. One of the hands saw you riding north this morning." Catherine faced her father squarely, her composure intact despite the fear James could sense beneath her calm exterior. "I went to the reservation, Father. The army was there to inform the Cheyenne they're being relocated again. I helped negotiate a compromise that will allow the school term to finish." Henderson's face reddened further with each word. "After I explicitly forbade you from going near that place. After everything that's happened." He turned his glare on James. "And you, Sheriff, did you know about this? Did you encourage this defiance?" James shook his head. "I delivered the message as requested, Mr. Henderson. Your daughter made her own decision to attend the meeting." He stepped forward slightly, and her presence made a significant difference. "The compromise she helped broker will ensure a more peaceful transition and benefit everyone in the territory, including the ranchers." Henderson wasn't interested in these broader implications. "I don't care if she negotiated peace for the whole damned frontier. She deliberately disobeyed me and went to those savages behind my back." He turned back to Catherine, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. "Was he there? That warrior you so shamefully defended?" Catherine lifted her chin. "If you mean Swift Arrow, yes, he was present, as was his father and the other elders." Henderson's laugh was bitter and harsh. "Of course he was. And I suppose you had another touching reunion?" Before Catherine could respond, Matthew stepped forward, placing a restraining hand on his father's arm. "Father, perhaps we should continue this discussion inside." He glanced meaningfully toward the ranch hands who had gathered at a distance, watching the confrontation with undisguised interest. Henderson shook off his with a final nod to Matthew, who silently communicated that he would look out for his sister. James mounted his horse and reluctantly departed. As he rode back toward Blackridge in the gathering dusk, he found himself reflecting on the day's events and the complex interplay of cultures, obligations, and personal feelings that had unfolded. Two peoples with different ways of life were being forced together and pulled apart by forces larger than any individual. Yet it was individuals like Catherine, Two Hawks, and even the conflicted Swift Arrow who ultimately determined whether those interactions led to understanding or bloodshed. The weeks that followed brought significant changes to Blackridge and its surrounding areas. As promised, the Army oversaw the partial relocation of the Cheyenne, with the eastern third of the reservation remaining temporarily under their control. The school continued to operate, though Catherine Henderson was no longer its teacher. Reports reached James that a missionary's wife had taken over those duties, with considerably less enthusiasm and effectiveness than her predecessor. As for Catherine herself, rumors circulated through the town that she had been all but confined to the Henderson Ranch, her father's punishment for her defiance. Matthew Henderson, when encountered in town on ranch business, was tight-lipped about family matters. It was only when James received the letter delivered by the weekly mail coach that he learned the full truth. The letter, written in Catherine's neat hand, explained that she had left Blackridge 2 days earlier, taking the eastbound stage to Cheyenne City, where she had accepted a position teaching at a new school for girls. "My father has made it clear that I am no longer welcome in his home unless I renounce all connection with the reservation and the people there," she wrote. "As I cannot in good conscience do this, I have chosen to make my own way. I hold no bitterness toward him. He acts from beliefs deeply ingrained over decades of frontier life. The letter continued, thanking James for his support and expressing hope that the compromise she had helped negotiate would ease tensions during the difficult transition ahead. There was no mention of Swift Arrow or any personal regrets, but between the carefully penned lines, James could sense the pain of multiple separations, from family, from purpose, and from possibilities that could never be realized. He folded the letter carefully and placed it in his desk drawer, next to the earlier correspondence from Running Elk that had warned of growing tensions. Both letters represented roads not taken, opportunities missed, conflicts forestalled but not truly resolved. Life in Blackridge continued its relentless forward march. Winter settled over the territory, bringing the harsh beauty and challenges that the season always delivered to the frontier. James maintained the peace, as he had always done, with fairness and quiet authority. If he sometimes found himself looking north toward the diminished reservation, or east toward Cheyenne City, he kept such moments of reflection private. On a bitter January day, as snow swirled through the town's single street, a rider approached from the north. James, completing his morning rounds, recognized Two Hawks despite the heavy blanket wrapped around the old chief's shoulders. They met outside the sheriff's office, where James quickly ushered his unexpected visitor inside and stoked the fire to drive away the chill. "This is an unexpected honor," James said, pouring coffee for them both. "What brings you to Blackridge in such weather?" Two Hawks accepted the coffee with grateful hands. "I bring news and a request," he said, his voice showing the strain of age and the difficult winter. "My people move to the northern reservation next week, as agreed. The school is closed now. The children learn to be Cheyenne again, not white." There was no bitterness in his tone, merely a statement of fact. "My son left 2 days ago to join his mother's people beyond the northern mountains." James nodded, unsurprised by this information. "And your request?" Two Hawks reached into his blanket and withdrew a small package wrapped in soft leather. "For Catherine Henderson, a gift from my son before he left, a remembrance." He placed it on the table between them. "He asks that you send it to her in the city of white stone buildings." James understood he meant Cheyenne City, named for the very people being displaced from its vicinity. "I'll see that she receives it," James promised. Two Hawks nodded, satisfied with this assurance. "There is a letter also, words my son could not speak directly." The old chief's eyes held a lifetime of wisdom and sorrow. Sometimes the heart must travel a different path from the feet. After finishing his coffee and warming himself by the fire, Two Hawks prepared to depart. At the door, he turned to James one last time. "We will not meet again in this life, Sheriff Harrington. My people go north. I'm too old for another beginning, but I will see them safely there." Despite his matter-of-fact tone, the farewell held undeniable weight. James extended his hand, which the chief clasped firmly. "Safe journey, Chief Two Hawks. May your people find peace in their new home." With a final nod, the old man mounted his pony and rode back into the swirling snow, a solitary figure representing the end of an era in Blackridge's short history. The following week, James arranged for Swift Arrow's package to be sent to Catherine via the stagecoach line. He added a brief note of his own, updating her on developments and expressing hope for her happiness in her new position. He didn't expect a reply, understanding that Catherine was likely building a new life that looked forward rather than back. Yet 3 weeks later, a letter arrived, thanking him for sending the package and sharing news of her successful adjustment to life in Cheyenne City. The gift from Swift Arrow was a pair of moccasins he made himself, she wrote, adorned with porcupine quills in a pattern that signifies a journey. His letter spoke of paths that diverge but remain connected in memory and spirit. It was a fitting closure to a chapter that could never have had a conventional ending. Her words carried a mature acceptance that impressed James, who had seen too many people broken by the frontier's harsh realities rather than shaped into stronger versions of themselves. Spring came to Blackridge with its usual burst of renewal. The Henderson Ranch continued operations under Henry's stern guidance, though James heard through town gossip that the old rancher had aged notice.